So in this module, we're going to be looking at what happens after a conviction. We call this activity sentencing, that is, giving to someone their meted out punishment. But there's a range of punishments that you need to be aware of, and in fact there's a range of categories of punishments that you should be aware of. So sentencing is defined as sort of the formal pronouncement of punishment, and this is following a criminal conviction. Sentences, these formal pronouncements, are imposed by a judge. Some jurisdictions do allow juries to make the sentencing pronouncement. And in most state and federal penal codes, a fixed or specific range of punishment is prescribed. So as you're doing your reading, you'll come across the federal sentencing guidelines. There's been some cases about this over the years. But what we're looking for here is to stay in bounds and to appropriately, sort of justly mete out punishment in those cases. So what are the purposes of punishment or sentencing? Sentencing has at least arguably four goals. Sentencing can be used to rehabilitate someone. It can be used to deter. That is, once the story gets out, if you do this kind of behavior and you're convicted, this is what's going to happen to you. So there is an element of being deterred from behavior, even if you're not the one engaged in the actual case that's being tried and the punishment that's being meted out. There's an incapacitation element too. So this one isn't so much about punishing the wrongdoer or retribution. It's about removing a dangerous person from society. So you can imagine that someone could be incapacitated who wasn't a criminal, someone who had a mental defect or a mental disease, and they were dangerous, but they weren't sort of morally evil. They just did not know how to control themselves. You might want to incapacitate someone, put them in a hospital of some sort. But for purposes of the criminal justice system, incapacitation, you need to think about removing a dangerous, convicted criminal from society. So maybe someone who is not an option for community supervision or probation. And then retribution. There is a sense in which we might have an aim of actually punishing someone for doing something bad. So rehabilitation, deterrence, incapacitation, and retribution. So you can think about those things as you're reading through and listening to this short module. What do you think the aim of sentencing ought to be? Is it merely to punish? Are there other admirable goals? Does it matter what the person did? Does it matter the person's age? Those are all important questions that we should consider and you should be thinking of as you're working through this module. So it is interesting to see, and oftentimes in a course that I teach, I will give 3 examples of cases that I worked on, and they range from 25 years in prison to 30 years in prison. The example that I give of these 3 different instances causes some people to sort of shrink back and not understand what's going on. Why would someone get put in prison for 30 years if they got picked up for a DWI, but they didn't hurt anyone and they did no property damage? So as you're looking at the case-by-case basis, looking to see what the context is and the various state laws, what if it were the case that because the person who was convicted in that case had so many other felonies and had been picked up so many times that state law says if you do it again, it's a minimum of 25 years in prison. So he did something again that was a felony, so his minimum was 25 years. If we were to take it out of context, it seems odd, but as you're thinking through, reading through the cases, and even in your own life as you encounter these things, if you're a law enforcement officer or a defense lawyer or a prosecutor or a judge, so you look at these things, know that it is not entirely clear to me that there is a precise, almost definition, a 2 + 2 = 4, what should happen in a given case. There's wide discretion in the results, and there is also, because of that, sentencing disparity. And at some point, it can get to such a degree of disparity that something is not fair. So this person got 5 months in jail, this person got 5 years in prison. If they were able to prove up that both of them did the exact same thing, there may be an instance of is this fair kind of question going through your mind. So mandatory sentences do eliminate sentencing disparity, but they fail to take into consider individual circumstances, potentially mitigating factors. When we're talking about sentencing, we want to pay attention to the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, and that amendment, among other things, prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. So really, there's not going to be any winning arguments proposed to a court that a particular sentence itself, so that is, let's say, a 5-year sentence or even a 50-year sentence, is cruel and unusual. Now, if it was a 5-year sentence of being chained up and not allowed to leave your cell, isolated, very little water, almost to the point of dehydration, and very little food, well, yes, those 5 years would be almost torturous, and that's unusual. It's also cruel. So we're not typically talking about the length of time of the sentence, but the conditions. However, if there is some sort of just grossly disproportional sentence applied to a relatively minor infraction of the law, that might itself be evidence of a cruel and unusual punishment, which is not allowed under the Eighth Amendment. So, sentencing guidelines do have a tendency to reduce sentencing disparity. Even if they're not mandatory, if they allow a court or a judge to have sort of, this is the range of punishments generally, then a judge can move up or move down based on given circumstances, but the starting point is typically about the same. That doesn't mean there is no disparity among judges, for instance, who are giving the sentences, but it does reduce it. It tends to reduce it because there's a norming benefit of having guidelines that all, for instance, federal judges use. Now, the juvenile justice system is not criminal. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, in the state of Texas, the Supreme Court of Texas hears juvenile cases. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals hears adult criminal cases. So you might hear someone as a juvenile delinquent as opposed to calling that person a criminal, even though they're the same acts. Now, in your text, you will read about the different ways that various states handle juvenile detention or juvenile hearings and court cases, and then the punishment. Texas uses a particular way of understanding the sentence or the punishment to be given to someone who is a juvenile or a minor, and it is not the same among all the states. So keep in mind as you're reading through the chapter that there are differences, and if you're looking for Texas, for instance, it is called the juvenile contiguous blend, and the juvenile court may impose a juvenile correctional sanction that may remain in force after the offender is beyond the age of the court's extended jurisdiction, at which point the offender may be transferred to the adult correctional system. Well, that's Colorado, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Texas, but there are other states who handle it differently. So it does matter what particular jurisdiction you're in, but typically all jurisdictions are going to have a carve-out to some degree to treat those who are minors differently. They want to treat someone who is not sort of a full-age adult in a way, hopefully, that is more like a parent than like the state. So what types of sentences exist? Well, there's a range. All the things that you might think of are probably a ticket, so a small fine, to taking someone's life with the death penalty. So the death penalty is certainly the most egregious punishment that can be administered. Imprisonment could be anywhere from, let's say, from 2 years to life, or from 5 to 99. So it can be for a human being on earth forever. Then there's probation, and that is widely used. And then there are intermediate sanctions, and then there are fines, forfeiture, and restitution that typically have to do with value of property or cash. We'll take a short look at each one of those. So 10 years ago, in 2012, 33 states and the federal government had death penalty laws. Interesting, just a fun fact, the death penalty was declared unconstitutional in 1972 and then constitutional back in 1976. So just something to think about. So not all states allow the death penalty, but there are a number of them that do. When we use the term imprisonment, that means a person can be imprisoned in either a jail or in a penitentiary or a prison. In Texas, for instance, our state jail felony, which is roughly a 4th-degree felony, is up to 2 years in a county jail. Typically, when you commit a felony, you go to prison, and 3rd degree, 2nd degree, 1st degree, and even capital crimes, that's where you go, is to a prison. But being imprisoned, jail does count. Interestingly, as your textbook talks about it, prisoners used to not have rights, or at least most of them were considered gone, even to the point that they might be considered slaves. That is no longer the case. Prisoners do have rights, even constitutional rights, and those rights can be infringed. A couple more categories of sentences. First is the difference between determinate and indeterminate. So a determinate sentence is a fixed term, such as 5 years in prison, whereas an indeterminate sentence is more open-ended. Maybe it's 2 to 15 or 2 to 10 or something like that. The sentence is not yet fully determined, so that's indeterminate. Concurrent versus consecutive. Imagine if you had a 5-year prison sentence for 3 individual victims. Well, the court would have to decide whether you were going to serve those 5-year sentences concurrently or consecutively, or stacked. So if the judge stacked them, the person would spend a total of 15 years in prison. If the judge allowed the sentences to be served concurrently, each day that the incarcerated person was sort of serving would count 1 for the victim A, 1 for victim B, and 1 for victim C. So the maximum amount of time would be 5 years if they were concurrent, even though technically they were 5 years times 3. If they were stacked or they were consecutive, it would be a total of 15 years. Probation is everywhere. It is used all the time, and this is where someone who has been convicted of a crime is allowed to remain relatively free in the community, but there are going to be some court-imposed conditions. So you can call this probation or community supervision. Probation is where there has been a conviction, and probation is in lieu of going to prison or going to jail. So the offender is under the supervision of a probation officer or a community supervision officer. So probation is a privilege, not a right. You cannot demand this. You can certainly ask for it, and if the circumstances are convincing to a judge, a criminal defendant might get probation. You can imagine that probation can be helpful. Number one, it's cheaper for the state, but number two, the person realizes that if any false move, they could go to prison. They're more likely, at least in theory, to walk a straight line, to get back into the community, serve family, get a job, those kinds of things. So probation is used all the time, and in cases where it's not horribly egregious behavior, it's probably the right move. You're still not free. You have to check in with your probation or your community supervision officer, drug test. There are rules and conditions, and if you violate those conditions, then there can be a short motion to revoke your probation and send you to prison. So that's sort of hanging over your head all the time if you are the criminal defendant who has been given probation. But it seems to me most people would prefer that to actually going to a cell. So there are also intermediate sanctions. These are less severe and also less costly than prisons, but they are more restrictive potentially than traditional probation. So community supervision means you have to show up at a particular place and work for free. Typically this place is going to be a nonprofit, or it could be the government. So you're going to essentially be forced to volunteer your time. You're going to be doing free labor for a soup kitchen or something like that. Oftentimes judges, depending on the circumstances, will take into consideration what was done and maybe if there was a learning experience at a particular nonprofit. Also, there's electronic monitoring, getting an ankle bracelet where your movements not only do does the government know where you are, but also can send alarms if you go past a particular point. If you ever seen one of those fenceless fences, like an electronic fence for a dog, you can't actually see it, but if the dog's collar, the dog inside the collar, crosses or gets too close to this sort of invisible electrical line, it'll either shock the dog or high-pitched noise or something. Well, we don't shock people, but there can be alarms sent off, and then the police will come pick you up if you were supposed to remain in a particular location. So, although it's more restrictive than probation, it is probably still better than the alternative of being stuck in prison. It gives freedom of mobility. Think about this as a more sophisticated sort of house arrest. Finally, fines. So fines are monetary punishment, and there are two places where those who are convicted must pay money. One to the state, and then two to the victim. So if you have a fine, that fine typically goes to the government. It is a punishment. If you get a ticket, you're getting a fine. That's the kind of sentence or punishment you're getting. Fines are paid to the state. Now, on the other side is restitution. Restitution means a victim is restored to his or her original position prior to the loss or injury. So if you have someone who vandalized someone's home and destroyed a window and destroyed a door, replacing the door and the window, it's costly. So whatever that cost is, the criminal defendant might have to pay money to restore that person. And that's called restitution. That is paid to the victim. Now, in between those two is forfeiture. And there's a lot to be argued here about civil asset forfeiture, but in a non-civil case, if you are driving a car and you've got drugs in the car and you're using the car to sell the drugs and using the car to travel between a house that is selling drugs, a house that is making drugs, or if you're using that car and someone gets arrested for it, the state may take that car in forfeiture. And different ways of doing that. But that is how police departments, district attorneys' offices, federal government, that is sometimes how they get property. It's valuable. So not only will you forfeit the drugs, which are illegal, but also maybe the instrumentality, like a car. So there are law enforcement agencies who are driving around, sometimes even nice cars, that were forfeited because of their use in criminal activity.